Hello, guys. Welcome to Signs and Wonders. We got James Snapp Jr. coming back. Good pleasure to have you back there, sir. He's going to be talking about Mark 16 and its authenticity. I guess we will open up with a word of prayer. Dear Lord Jesus Christ, please bless over James Snapp Jr. and let his words be true. And bless over all of us watching and everyone in Oregon and California with the wildfires. And thank you for everything you've given us. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, guys, so thanks again for coming, James. Sorry, I guess we got started right on time. It was a little late, but we made it, so I guess I'll just let you take it away.
All right, well, Mark chapter 16, the Gospel of Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, is one of the major textual variants in the New Testament. It's probably the most written about textual variant. The other two that get a lot of attention are the Johannine Comma in 1 John 5:7, and also the story of the woman taken in adultery. But this one is definitely right up there in the top three as far as subjects in textual criticism that tend to get a lot of attention. There are some others. These are not the only two. There's also the story of the angel in the garden where Jesus sweat drops of sweat like blood. But there's also the word from the cross where Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." But Mark 16, 9 through 20 is one that affects the general shape of the Gospel of Mark, because without it, the scene just kind of stops in chapter 16, verse 8, and you don't see appearances, or at least you don't see bodily appearances mentioned of Jesus in the course of Mark's narrative. And so it's often said that textual variants don't matter to doctrine. This is one that I say would definitely affect interpretation. It affects how you interpret the passage. For instance, several years ago, Dr. John MacArthur preached about this and spread many statements that are untrue. But in the course of that, he also said that Mark 16, 9 through 20 is a bad ending. I think he used that exact term in the course of his sermon. And it's interesting that sometimes busy preachers can look into textual variants that they know will come up in the course of their listeners' studies of what they preached. But sometimes it's not easy to find reliable materials about this particular passage, because so much has been written about it, like the book of Proverbs says, where there are many words, there are many errors. And this is no exception. Some of the errors, for instance, from the late Norman Geisler, said that Mark 16, 9 through 20 is lacking in many of the oldest and most reliable manuscripts. And this is a claim that has circulated both in print and online. Several other commentators have made either the exact same claim or claims that are very similar to it.
Yeah, if you look that up on BibleHub right now, you'll see that. You'll see a quote that says exactly what you said.
Yeah. Larry Richards has also written that in many ancient Greek manuscripts. So the gospel ends at verse 8. But in real life, the number of Greek manuscripts that we have, without imagining manuscripts, but in terms of the manuscripts that we actually have on hand, where we can verify what the manuscripts say, the number of manuscripts that in the text of the Gospel of Mark at the end of verse 8 is 3. That's Codex Vaticanus from the 300s, Codex Sinaiticus from the mid-300s, and manuscript number 304, which is technically not exactly a New Testament manuscript. It makes the list, but it's technically a commentary manuscript in which there's some of the text, and then the commentary, and then some of the text, and some of the commentary. And what we have in the case of 301 is a manuscript that was written for the sake of the commentary. The commentary is what gets the title, but the text of Mark is included along with the commentary in pieces. And so that's another manuscript that ends with the commentary that discusses the ending of Mark. But there's no final colophon. There's no closing statement that says this is the end of the Gospel of Mark. Instead, in 304, we have a little ditty about how pleasant it is for a copyist when he reaches the end of his book. but we don't have the usual ending title that says this is the end of the Gospel of Mark. And so 304 is kind of, it makes the list, but there's continuous questions about how much weight to put on 304. It's not a particularly early manuscript, and most of its text is Byzantine. But the real contest comes in the case of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. These are two major manuscripts, important manuscripts, both representing the Alexandrian transmission line. But before their production, before Vaticanus was made, while Vaticanus was still a cow walking around, long before that, Irenaeus in the 100s. So we're not talking about manuscripts from the 300s. Those are our earliest two manuscripts of Mark chapter 16. But well before that, Irenaeus, one of the most important patristic writers, wrote a book called, several books all in one composition called Against Heresies. And in the course of Against Heresies, he wrote in book 3 of Against Heresies, he quoted Mark chapter 16, verse 19, and he said it very specifically. He said, toward the end of Mark's gospel, we have the statement, and from there on he quotes Mark 16, verse 19. So in Irenaeus's copies, even though Irenaeus, of course, lived in what is now France, that's not where he grew up. He eventually was stationed there as a bishop. But Irenaeus had grown up in Asia Minor. He had visited Rome, and he was stationed in France, in Lyon, on Lugdunum. And Irenaeus, of course, when you write against heresies, you want to be kind of picky about what text you use. You don't want to be accused of using a challenged or very, very debatable text. But Irenaeus used this passage and did not mention any doubts about it when he used it. And now most of Irenaeus's books, most of this particular book, is only available in Latin. But as it turns out, in manuscript number 1582 and in manuscript number 72, these are later manuscripts, but in their margin, alongside Mark 16:19, they have a note in Greek that states that Irenaeus, in book 3 of Against Heresies, Irenaeus, who lived near the time of the apostles, quotes this passage. So there's that affirmation in Greek of Irenaeus quoting from Mark 16:19. That puts Mark 16:9 through 20 there in Irenaeus' manuscript in the 2nd century. And so that would be no later than 180. We have Irenaeus reading, quoting with authority from his copy of Mark that had these verses. Also, Justin Martyr, in his book called First Apology. Now, one thing to realize about Justin Martyr is he doesn't often make specific quotations. So sometimes you see, well, Justin Martyr, he just kind of uses the same language, but he doesn't really quote it. That's what he did typically. It's an exception when he actually specifies which gospel account he's quoting from. But Justin, in First Apology, chapter 45, quotes from, or rather, utilizes Mark 16:20 when he describes how the disciples went preaching everywhere, preaching the word. Also, Tatian, Tatian, made a combination of the 4 Gospels, a work in which Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all combined into one continuous narrative without a lot of repetition. And in the Diatessaron, Tatian included Mark 16:9 through 20. So in his copies as well, we see Mark 16:9 through 20 included in the Gospel of Mark. And one of the ways we can deduce that, because you might be wondering if you know that we don't really have lots of copies of the Diatessaron, we can just pick them off a tree. How do we know that? Well, in the Western branch of Diatesseronic witnesses, in Codex Valdensis, we have the Gospel of Mark, and these verses are there. And also we have in the Eastern branch, we have the Arabic Diatessaron. And when we look at how the text is arranged, we see basically the same arrangement in both branches. So you can't make really judgment calls on small details, but on the large details of was this in the text, there we have the support of Tatian. So that means we have in Irenaeus' copies, in Justin's copies, and in Tatian's copies in the 2nd century, we have this passage in the text. Also, if you look at all of the other copies, you have this passage in the text. That oftentimes you'll see footnotes that say, well, some copies have it and some copies don't. Well, if you draw things into focus and say, well, when you say some, what exactly are you talking about when you say some copies have it and some copies don't? In terms of simple number, about 1,640 have it and 3 copies don't. So if it was a democracy, now it's not a democracy, but if it were, we would have 1,640 on the scoreboard in favor of inclusion, and we'd have 3 on the scoreboard against. But those 2 are important copies from the 300. Most of those are massive. That massive number come much later copies. But every copy is a significant witness that has a voice, and to just dismiss it by saying, well, some do and some don't, isn't really an equitable way to deal with the evidence, especially when there's, like I said, this very important patristic evidence from well before the time when Vaticanus and Sinaiticus were made, from Irenaeus, from Justin, and from Tatian. And we could probably throw in, arguably, if you read the research of the late Robert Stein, Robert Stein believed that another composition, a 4th one, called Epistula Apostolorum, he also believed that this author too shows an awareness of what we know as Mark 16:9-20. So that would be 4. Also later on in the 200s, the book called De Re Baptismate, the author of that appears to be aware of and refer to the contents of this. It's not an exact quote, but it's enough to get that witness included in the UBS apparatus. There's also an interesting reference from the works of one of the apprentices or students of a man named Porphyry. Now, Porphyry was not a Christian. He was a very enthusiastically anti-Christian writer. And his assistant named Hierocles liked to copy things that Porphyry had written. Eusebius of Caesarea, at one point in one of his casual comments, he just says that the work of Hierocles mimics the work of Porphyry, right down to the words and phrases. And in a work called Apocriticus by Macarius Magnes in the very early 400s, he responds to a work that fits the description that we have of Hierocles, one of Hierocles' compositions that echoes the work of Porphyry. And in this composition, the author is saying, well, these Christians, with all their aspirations to be leaders in their churches, here's the way they should settle things. The Christians should just come to each other and say, well, you want to be bishop? You want to be bishop? Let's settle this by seeing who can drink poison the best. And that is a reference that Porphyry, or Hierocles rather, uses to kind of make a jibe at the Christians, but he's clearly using the passage in Mark 16:17-18 as his basis for that accusation. And we could take a closer look at that and see more details about it. But that's a writing from around the year 305. And Porphyry was dead by that time, but Hierocles was still very much alive. So there we have some witnesses from before the time of Hierocles, well before the time of Vaticanus, that we can look at and say, well, this text was in the manuscripts that were being used by the church long before we come to the manuscripts that have survived Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. And when we look after Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, we see it very well distributed. When we look at the patristic evidence, we see a tremendous amount of geographical evidence, all the way from Patrick in Ireland to Esnica-Golb, all the way over in Armenia in the 400s. And we see Syriac evidence. The Syriac manuscript is often referred to as a manuscript that comes into play against the ending at Mark 16, verse 8. But before the Sinaitic Syriac, we have the Syriac writer named Aphrahat, who uses Mark 16 and quotes from that same passage. So when we look at the patristic evidence, when we consider not just the manuscript evidence, but we consider all the evidence that matters, which definitely includes the patristic evidence, then there we see a very wide and very, very, very authoritative use of Mark 16:9-20. And did you have any particular questions you'd like to investigate?
No, not right now. I'm just kind of chatting in the live chat, but I'm just listening to you talk. So I don't have any questions at this second.
Okay. Well, one question that comes up is, well, how did it get lost, and why do we have not only Mark 16 and 20, but we also have in six Greek manuscripts, that's the total number, six, what's called the shorter ending. And if you look at the evidence and try to put things into place on say both a geographical and a chronological scale, what looks like happened is that at some point between the composition of the Gospel of Mark in Rome and the beginning of the transmission of Mark in Egypt, verses 9 through 20 were lost either by accident or by conscious rejection. Now, I think that conscious rejection has the stronger case, because when you look in Mark 16, 9 through 20, there are some internal details that indicate that this passage is not written as initially as the end of the Gospel of Mark. You don't see a mention of specifically of Galilee, and also when you come to verse 9, things kind of restart. Mary Magdalene, who was just mentioned before, is mentioned again. Meanwhile, her two companions, who we saw in the past scene, suddenly, like a flash of lightning, suddenly they're gone from the stage. They're no longer mentioned by the narrator. So there are some indications that there's some kind of a break at the end of verse 8. But this is not really the question of whether or not Mark wrote this, but whether or not it was initially in the autograph of the Gospel of Mark. And this, I think, is a question where oftentimes people say, well, if it wasn't written by Mark, then it's not original. But that's never really been the question of what determines the original text. When we look at the Gospel of John, if you look at the end of John chapter 20, it ends nice and neat right there. And a lot of commentators will say, well, initially, John ended there at the end of chapter 20, but still we have this other whole chapter here, and that's what we have in the text. Also, if you look in the Old Testament, for instance, at the books of Moses, some would say, well, the text says Moses died. What are you going to do with that? Did Moses write about his own death in advance, or did Joshua come along and finish the text for him? Also in Jeremiah chapter 52, as we have it, at the end of chapter 51, the text says very plainly, here is where the words of Jeremiah end, and yet you have another whole chapter there that's part of the text. We don't throw out Jeremiah 52 just because it's not the work of Jeremiah. The question is this part of the original text or not, as the book began to be disseminated in the churches, or rather in the Old Testament, in the Old Testament community. So the question of is it there or not, that's the real question. And I would say that nobody in the church at Rome, in the Christian community, would willingly distribute a text to Mark that ended at verse 8 when they had any other option. And I would propose, and I go into this in more detail in the book, that my proposal is that somebody had a Markan composition that summarized the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, and they put that there to conclude Mark's otherwise unfinished narrative. And so when the Gospel of Mark began to be distributed for church use, it there has these verses. And that's the gist of my theory, and that I think explains both the external and the internal evidence. A later copyist looking at it might say, wait a second, this isn't from the main author, because they would see the Gospel of Mark not so much as the Gospel of Mark, but as the memoirs of St. Peter. They would say, Peter's the one with the authority. We don't care if Mark wrote this little continuation or not. We want what Peter wrote. And so an Alexandrian copyist could say, that's a trivial thing, that Mark wrote that didn't have Peter's authority behind it. And so that could be the reason why it was rejected. Also, in Egypt, and particularly in Egypt, that's where we see the shorter ending arise. And the idea is that at some point, when Mark began to be distributed in Egypt, they didn't like the idea of stopping at verse 8, and so somebody, somewhere early on, wrote the shorter ending. And that is what you'll see in some footnotes where it talks about then Jesus appeared to Peter and the rest, and sent them forth from east to west. That's a particularly Egyptian reading. We don't really see that outside of manuscripts from Egypt, except in manuscript number 240 that has it in the margin as a reading that somebody saw sometime. So that takes care of the shorter ending. That was something to fill in the gap there until later on verses 9 to 20 showed up, and then they were added on after that. That's why, by the way, that's why we see when we see the two together, the shorter ending comes first before verses 9 through 20, because that's how it showed up in that particular locale. But everywhere else we look for the ending of Mark, we see it in Rome, we see it in France, we see it in Ireland, we see it in Britain, we see it in North Africa, we see it in Palestine, a very broad area. And I think that the broadness with which it was widely, and this is I'm not talking about medieval times, but in the time where there was still an emperor on the throne of the Roman Empire, all these witnesses come up from this broad, very broad area, showing that it was used as part of the church's text. So
it's interesting, yeah. So I wonder why there's so much discrepancy about, like, it must be like a monetary incentive or a way for these apologetics to like make a name for themselves or something. It's the only thing I could see that they would keep saying to this. Like, why hold on to the theory that like, for instance, Mark 16 9 to 20 is a later edition. Like, I don't understand, like, if there's so much manuscript evidence to support that it's authentic, right, James? And another thing I wanted to ask, and I'm sure the audience would be kind of curious, like, a lot of people are saying that you know your stuff, and you really do. Like, I thank you for what you're doing, but like, what is it that you do? Like, it really sounds like you know your stuff. Like, have you actually studied the manuscripts, or like you go to school for it, or like, obviously you spend a lot of time looking into this and studying it. I know you're a pastor, right?
Yes. I preach at a small church here in central Indiana, and textual criticism is just one aspect of the job that it's kind of like my work-related obsession.
Nice, yeah, you're passionate about it. So why is it, do you think then that there's so many websites like bibleHub? If you go to look up that verse, like I was saying, Mark 16, the first thing you'll see is a big print on top of the screen. I'll do it right now, actually. I'll screen share it with people so they can see what I'm talking about. Mark 16 verses 9 to 20. Yeah, okay. Let's see, Bible Gateway. Yeah, here's biblegateway.com. Let me share my screen. And right here, you see, the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. So, like, everywhere you go, it says that. I wonder why that is.
Well, that's a very common way in which it's presented, and lots of footnotes have this fault in which they are very, very vague. I don't think there's a single footnote in the New American Standard that actually mentions any patristic evidence. But when it comes to patristic evidence, it's really some verses in the Bible. The first time we see them isn't in a manuscript, but rather in a quotation from Scripture made by a patristic writer. So when the patristic evidence is allowed into the picture changes, sometimes drastically. But I think some footnote writers are a little shy about mentioning patristic evidence in a footnote because it just gives the reader that much more to think about. And the footnote writer says, well, let's keep it simple for the poor, those poor simple souls out there. We're just going to mention the manuscripts, but avoid mentioning the patristic evidence. But when you mention the patristic evidence, like I said, the picture changes drastically. You go from having just a few manuscripts of Mark in general in the opening centuries of the church to having dozens and dozens of quotations. And in the case at hand, in Mark 16, 9 through 20, we have over 40 clear patristic references to the contents of these verses. And by patristic evidence, I'm talking about evidence while there was a Roman emperor on the throne of Rome. So we're not talking just medieval evidence with lots of later manuscripts, but early on, Mark 16, 9 through 20 was just as widespread as the rest of the Gospel of Mark. You can see it quoted everywhere. But one of the reasons why those inaccurate or very vague statements get circulated is there's a huge amount of misinformation about the passage, and sometimes this could be something that gets distributed by a well-meaning commentator or by a well-meaning interpreter who is not trying to deceive anybody, but he is himself deceived or misled by his understanding of something that he has read in another commentary. Lots of the older commentaries contain quite a bit of misinformation about this particular passage. For instance, in William Lane's commentary, it's a very well-known commentary, probably on the shelf of almost every theological library in America. Lane's commentary gets things wrong practically in every sentence that he writes when it comes to the Gospel of Mark, verses 16 through 20. If you're reading along and you find yourself reading something about Clement and Origen did not have any awareness of these verses, and then a little while later there's mention of asterisk and abeli, and then a little while later it says some Ethiopic manuscripts don't have these verses. In that case, if you're reading these things in a commentary, you're probably just reading an echo of an earlier commentary by Bruce Metzger. It's this thing here, a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. Metzger made several claims in his textual commentary that are quite one-sided and in some ways inaccurate. Now, Metzger himself, early on, distributed information that he later on found out was not true about the Ethiopic copies. The Ethiopic being the language of Ge'ez from Ethiopia. And it was stated by another researcher before Metzger that some copies in Ethiopic end at Mark 16, verse 8. At least that's what the writer appeared to be saying. But when people went back and looked at his notes in more detail, they realized actually he's just making this contraction here that people have misunderstood. He really didn't say what we thought he said, and so Metzger, to clear things up, collected up all the Ethiopic data that he could, and in 1980, Bruce Metzger basically retracted that claim and said, well, look, we had this terrible misunderstanding. We thought the Ethiopic copies, that a few of them did not have it. As it turns out, we just misunderstood what we were reading, and they all do have Mark 16, 9 through 20. The thing is, some of them have, a good percentage of them have, the shorter ending before verses 16 through 20, but all of them have verses 16 through 20. But to this day, in Metzger's own handbook, even though on one page he'll admit that mistake and he'll point out how he went through a lot of trouble to correct it. But if you turn the page a little bit, in the fourth edition of Metzger's own handbook, the one that was revised by Bart Ehrman and Metzger still repeat that same claim that is corrected on an earlier page of the same book. So if that's what Metzger himself ends up saying, just imagine how confused the rest of folks get when they look to Metzger and says, well, here's our authority, and he says the Ethiopic manuscripts, that some of them don't have it. Of course, Metzger himself would say now, after 1980, they do have it. But you can still find that claim about the Ethiopic manuscripts in writings about Mark 16 to 20. For instance, James White still continues to spread that claim, even though Metzger took it back 50 years ago. 50 years ago. And it's taken all this time, and we still don't have it prepared yet. So that's just one example. Eugene Nida, many translators probably have read books by Eugene Nida. He spread the same claim. Of course, he hadn't seen any Ethiopic manuscripts that said this, but even though he hadn't seen any manuscripts, he said, oh, not only are there some Greek manuscripts that end Mark 16, 9 through 20, that end the Gospel of Mark at chapter 16, verse 8, but they're important Ethiopic manuscripts. Well, Nida is just making stuff up. He'd never seen any Ethiopic manuscripts that ends at chapter 16, verse 8. Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, basically he just yeasted the claim. He just wanted to say, well, I don't want to say exactly what my source said, so I'm just going to spruce it up a little bit. And in the source of sprucing up a little bit, he made it even wronger than it had been. So that's one example of the kind of misinformation that gets spread in the scholarly circles, and even when sustained efforts are made to undo the damage, it still snowballs and does a lot of damage even after the claim has been withdrawn. For instance, the claim that There are some copies of Mark that have notes about Mark 16, 9 through 20, and that's true. That's about 15, maybe 16, depending on how you count it, because one's a copy of another. The Family 1 manuscripts and some of what's called the Jerusalem Colophon cluster of manuscripts have notes. Some of them mention the Eusebian canons and some don't, but they're all descendants of the same form of that particular note. And then Metzger, after mentioning those manuscripts, he then went on to say that there are other manuscripts that just have asterisks and obeli alongside Mark 16, 9 through 20. Now, the picture in people's head here is what we have in the case of Mark 16, is what we have in the case of John 7:53 through 8:11, of having a text, like a column of text with little marks all down the margin in the column. But in real life, I've tried to look up every single manuscript that's been mentioned that has these notes. I haven't seen a single manuscript that has asterisk or obeli that doesn't simply refer to a note in the margin that either confirms the same thing that we see in the Jerusalem Colophon manuscripts, the Family 1 manuscripts, or just simply a note to a commentary that's attributed to Victor of Antioch. In other words, if there are any real manuscripts like those that are supposed to be there, according to Craig Evans, you might have heard of Craig Evans, according to Dan Wallace, according to N.T. Wright, these guys are the ones spreading the claim, and they're looked upon as if they are people who have actually examined manuscripts. But if they know of any actual manuscripts that have asterisk and obeli beside Mark 16, 9 20, that don't have any notes alongside them that the Mark is referring to, I sure would appreciate them sending me a picture or putting a picture online, because I don't think they can verify that claim. I think when you look at Dan Wallace's claims of here are the manuscripts and look at those lists, well, I've looked at those manuscripts and they're not what he says they are. They're not testifying to what Dan Wallace says they're testifying to. Dan Wallace is simply wrong in his claim. He's simply incorrect. I don't think he's trying to be incorrect. I think he's just taking the writers for granted that he really shouldn't take for granted.
Oh, you don't think he's actually trying to do it to like make a name or something for himself? Because I don't know, like I kind of think maybe some of these people are like, you'd have to be, I don't know, not good at your job to like let some of the stuff get, if there's all this evidence saying, you know what I mean? The contrary to the contrary.
Well, in some cases that might be the case, but generally I do not have a very good gift of telepathy.
Yeah,
so,
I hear you. That's true.
So I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt, maybe more than I honestly should. But
you do give people the benefit of the doubt, yeah.
But I do try to say, unless a person has said, you know, I am the expert, I've studied this, and then he goes on to prove what he does not, and shows repeatedly he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Now, I would say that in the case of John MacArthur, who in his 2011 sermon, in which he called Mark 16:20 a bad ending, he specifically gave the impression that he looked into this subject in detail, and then he went on to show, and I think any textual critic who's experienced in the field will be able to verify, no, actually John MacArthur did not know what he was talking about. Many statements in that sermon are ridiculous.
Looks like we're having a bit of a sinless perfectionism debate in the channel here. Sorry. I had a debate on the channel a few days ago. It was about sinless perfectionism, and it looks like a few of the people are back in the channel firing things out. So sorry if my attention is kind of in two places, but yeah. So what are you currently? Do you preach at a church and you just do this manuscript research like in your spare time, or like do you work with any other people when you do the exegesis of scriptures and manuscripts, or how do you go?
Well, Dan Wallace is associated very closely with the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. They collect images of manuscripts. Sometimes just taking pictures that other people have made, but very often by traveling to distant monasteries and sometimes replacing what was an old, sometimes difficult to read microfilm image with a high quality digital image, and this is a very useful thing to do. And but after you've taken those pictures to bring them back, and those are many of them are online at the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts website. Now and then I'll use those images to study the text.
Nice.
And also many monastery manuscripts in this technological age we're in. Many of them have their manuscripts online. For instance, the Vatican Library is still in the process of digitizing all their images. So you can go online and see Codex Vaticanus. Codex Sinaiticus at the British Library, or most of it is at the British Library, but you can see it online. It has its very own website. When we come to these manuscripts, we can see things that you don't often see when you just have them listed in a commentary. For instance, you can see in Codex Sinaiticus that at the end of the Gospel of Mark, we don't have the original, we don't have the pages that were made by the copyists that made the pages that come before and after the ending of Mark. We have a cancel sheet, and this is something that is often not mentioned by writers writing about the Gospel of Mark and writing about the ending of Mark. But at the end of Mark, in Codex Sinaiticus, the rate of letters per line changes drastically, and then it shifts again the other way. But all this happens on those 4 pages. If you can picture like a church bulletin, like this paper here. What the initial copyist had made was taken out of the codex, and somebody else, probably the supervisor of the scriptorium, somebody else rewrote what was on those pages, but wrote it, what he thought it should say, and put that back in there. When he did that, he had left behind some telltale signs that indicate that he was aware of the missing 12 verses. Now, I won't go into the weeds too much here, but details about this are in my book, Authentic: The Case for the Gospel, the Case for Mark 16:9-20, which you can find on Amazon, or you can get a copy free from me by email. It's online in a number of venues. But basically, when you look at those replacement pages in Codex Sinaiticus, you can see the copyist of those 4 pages. This is not the main copyist of Codex Sinaiticus, but the copyist of those 4 pages, when he came to the end of Mark, he made the closing design particularly emphatic. Also, his rate of letters per column changed. It's like he knows what he wants, how he wants the text to end. But earlier on in chapter 16, he made a mistake and skipped some text. And when he skipped that text later on, when he came back to it, once he had turned the page and realized what had happened, he couldn't just throw the whole thing away and start over. So he began to stretch out his lettering. You can see those letters stretched out. You can see the word Jesus, which is usually contracted. You can see the word Jesus written out in full. And the reason for that is that he was trying to use as much space as possible so he could stretch some text into the next column and thus make it look like it was an ordinary ending. So that's Sinaiticus. Now in Vaticanus, there's an even more obvious anomaly where we see the copyist leave a completely blank column. And this copyist, usually he would never do that intentionally. In the whole New Testament portion of Vaticanus, he never leaves a blank column between books. Now, in the Old Testament portion of Vaticanus, we do see blank columns between books occasionally, but it's because of a clear production-related mechanism. And Dan Wallace tries to say, oh, no, it's not that, but it really actually is. We see where the columns change, where the format changes from 3 columns per page to the poetic books where it's 2 columns per page. Well, you basically have to have a shift there, so there's a blank column. And when we have the work of 2 scribes meet, where one copyist work ends and another copyist work begins, you have a blank column there because a new folio is being introduced. And at the end of the Old Testament portion itself, there at the end of the book of Daniel, with the story of Bel and the dragon, there at the end of Daniel, before Matthew begins, we have a blank column. So that's the end of the whole Old Testament. So it's obviously, it's clear there's going to be a space there. That's no mystery. So I don't know why Dan Wallace seems reluctant to acknowledge exactly why these spaces are filled up in the Old Testament, unless he's looking for an answer besides the obvious answer when it comes to why is the blank column there at the end of Mark. I think it's completely obvious that the copyist had Mark 16:9-20 on his mind, especially when you look at that page and the question comes, well, can you fit verses 9 to 20 into that blank space? Well, if you know how to compress your lettering, and the copyist of Sinaiticus knew how to do it, because we see him do that on the opening pages of Luke. In Vaticanus, if we were to take the lettering of the scribe and put Mark 16 to 20 into his letters using his handwriting, and I've done this digitally, cutting and pasting. It took a while, but cutting and pasting letters from his own letters that he wrote on that same page, and writing out Mark 16 to 20 in those letters. You can just go online, bro. And you can see Mark 16 to 20 in slightly compressed lettering will fit very snugly into that blank space. So I don't think there's really any question about why is this blank space there. It's there as memorial space. It's like the copyist in his master copy, he did not have Mark 16 to 20, but he recollected it from somewhere else, and so he made this attempt to. I don't know what the boss wants me to do here. I remember there being something else here, so I'm going to leave it up to the boss, the eventual owner of the manuscript, so that if he finds a manuscript and he wants to put it in, I'm going to leave him that option. And so we have this big blank space in Vaticanus at the end of Mark. That's a very significant factor that hardly ever comes into play when you see Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are simply mentioned, and yet this blank space in Vaticanus doesn't get mentioned. When the cancel sheets in Sinaiticus don't get mentioned. When you mention those things, the equation becomes very different. I think basically what you have is an extension of what happened in 1881, where Westcott and Hort, two scholars of the 1800s, when they proposed that all the Byzantine manuscripts can be set aside because the Byzantine text is a made-up text from the late 200s. That leaves the Western form of the text and the Alexandrian text, they would say the Western text is very unreliable, and that leaves us with the Alexandrian text. Well, the best representatives of the Alexandrian text are Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and so on the basis of those two manuscripts, they reject Mark 16, 9 through 20.
And those are important verses too, 9 through 20. That's when Mary found the Empty Tomb and everything, right? And Jesus and the stranger dressed in white was there, and they said Jesus has risen; he's not here. Those are pretty crucial verses to leave out of Scripture, I'd say. And it's not all of the Bibles that have them left out, is it? It's just like a few of the translations, or.
Well, when it comes to translations, almost all of them keep them in the text. Now, the Revised Standard Version, when it was first released, which was, I think, back in the 40s, it depends on if you have just the New Testament or with the Old Testament. Its first edition relegated the passage to a footnote, but in a later edition, it was restored into the text. The same thing goes for the story of the woman caught in adultery. This was also put back in the text. And in the Nestle-Aland text, it's interesting, I think, that in this, simply for the sake of tradition, the compilers of the Nestle-Aland Novum Testamentum Graece, the Greek New Testament that's published by the German Bible Society, the people that compiled that Greek text said very forthrightly that they did not believe that passage was original, and yet because of its traditional place in the history of the church, they're going to include it anyway. And that kind of shows you a willingness to put things in the text, even though they don't think that it's there. Now, I would say it's definitely there, but the idea of putting it in there even when you don't think it's there, it's like I would kind of rather go the RSV's route if I was them. I understand I'm not them, but it seems more candid to do what was done with the initial Revised Standard Version. Dan Wallace, I think, has gone on record at his blog saying that he would rather have the story of the woman caught in adultery relegated to the footnotes. Now, I don't know if he's going to get his way on that, but that's an example of how a simple attachment to will this sell if we don't have this passage in the text, oftentimes, or sometimes at least, seems to be, now again, I can't remind, so I'm just saying seems to be a more important question to some people than what is the original text.
What translation do you prefer, James?
Of the major versions on the market, I tend to go with the New King James Version, but with a judicious application of the margin notes. There are margin notes in the New King James that will tell you where the base text is different from the base text of what you find in most of the manuscripts. Also, there's a version
I heard the New King James was pretty much just based right off of the exact same manuscript as the original King James.
That claim gets kicked around a lot, but it's not entirely true. If you look in Luke 1:35, you'll see a difference between the text of that the King James was based on and the text that the New King James was based on. And that probably wasn't deliberate. I think what happened there was the people that made the New King James simply used a different edition of the Textus Receptus, which was the base text of the 1611 King James. But in that different edition, it happened to not have that phrase. So they're not exactly the same, but they're very, very close.
So people get really into translations.
But in the footnotes will tell you many times, not all the times, definitely, but many of the cases where the text of the King James deviates from the majority text. And in most of the cases, I would say go with the majority text reading. Not all of them, but most of them.
I like the King James. It's a really good translation, but I'm definitely not in the camp that says if you don't have King James, you're not saved. I have a King James only debate coming up on this channel tomorrow, actually. So, but
that's completely foreign to my way of thinking.
Yeah, but, some people get right into translations like they got to have the King James or you're not a Christian, and it's
not an entirely unwise instinct, but at the same time,
it's a good translation.
I think it's undeniable there are readings in the base text of the King James Version that have no indication of being the original reading, where you have massive evidence, not only from the majority of manuscripts, but also from multiple branches of transmission that all point in the same direction. That is not the way the Textus Receptus is pointing.
Like the
but also, you get into the question of translations. The Evangelical Heritage translation is not in the top 10, but it is a very, very well made translation. Also, the World English Bible, which is kind of still in development. It's always an almost done translation, but that's not quite the downside as it used to be, because so many new translations are constantly being updated anyway. So seeing the World English Bible, the WEB, being in that slight state of flux isn't quite the negative trait that it used to be. Comparable to some of the other major translations like the ESV and the NIV.
What do you think of the manuscript line? What was it? The Byzantine manuscript line being corrupt, or was it the Alexandria line? I'm not sure. Which is the one that the King James Bible is based off of?
The King James is based on the Textus Receptus, and the Textus Receptus is more or less from Matthew through Jude, let's say. Revelation's a different story. Revelation things get divided up entirely differently, or for the most part differently. But the Textus Receptus is the base text of the 1611 King James, and for the most part, the New King James.
Yeah.
And
the TR is from what family? The Alexandrian?
The TR is unique into itself to an extent, but in the Gospels, it would qualify as a representative of the Byzantine text. For the most part, it's like that all the way through Jude, but especially in the Gospels, it's just a better class of a representation of the Byzantine text.
So what do you think about the claim that the Alexandrian line has been corrupted at some point in history, and that's why even though we have manuscripts going back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries for the Alexandrian, is it? And,
yes.
Why would they say that? Why they say that these later editions, even from the 12th century, that was used in the TR, are more accurate because there was a corruption somewhere in history? I'm sure you've heard that before.
Yeah. Various King James only writers will spread the sort of claim. And you might see a chart every now and then that has the two lines of transmission. Whereas I'm like, what happened to the Western text? The idea is that there's two Bibles, one's from Antioch and one's from Alexandria, and it's the good guys and the bad guys. But it's not really so simple. When you look at the Alexandrian text, you'll see a text that was used by Christians, but it has definitely some corruptions. And when I say corruptions, I don't necessarily mean that somebody is deviously cackling about how they can smuggle some mistakes into the Word of God. There used to be a science fiction writer named Robert Heinlein, and in one of his books, one of his characters says, "Do not attribute to villainy what can be explained by stupidity." And in the Alexandrian text, you have a definite corruption. Quote. I'm sorry?
That's a good quote, eh?
Yeah. It's sometimes called Hanlon's razor.
Okay.
But the idea is, don't attribute to villainy what you can explain by accident.
Yeah, for sure. Like scribal errors.
Just riding along and loses his place, looks back up, thinks that he's where he just was, but actually he's 2 lines down. Poof, a passage disappears. And I think that's what's happened, for instance, in the case of Mark chapter 11, verse 26, where you have 2 lines of text ending with the same words. Copyist looks up from verse 25, looks back down, looks back up, thinks he's where he was, but because he thinks he's where he was, he's just lost a verse, just like that.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. We have so many manuscripts, and if you think about it, a lot of them are very similar. There's like most of the discrepancies are like and like letters left off of words and stuff, like very, very small percentage of it actually changes doctrinal meaning. And it's actually incredible if you think about how many people wrote the scriptures and over how long of a time period it was written, over thousands of years, and like how on papyrus, and how we have them from like all over the world, and they pretty much all tell the same kind of story. I think it's actually really incredible. Like if you think about it, like even nowadays we make mistakes with like computers and machines copying stuff. They did everything by hand, like by candlelight, and most of them were like uneducated, And the church was
it kind of very from scribe to scribe. Not all scribes were equally.
All of them were uneducated, but you know what I mean. Like they were also persecuted for the first 200 or 300 years of the Christian church.
Yeah.
So they had to hide in people's houses, and they couldn't be publicly giving out scripture. Like I'm pretty sure it was a crime to give out scripture at some point.
There were waves of persecution. They weren't always equally severe at all times, but definitely when it comes to a simple factor like the weather, that kind of gives the Alexandrian manuscripts, the ones from Egypt, a built-in advantage when it comes to when you see those footnotes that say the earliest manuscripts, because when a manuscript is made of papyrus, that tends to naturally rot away when you have a climate that's got humidity in it, that has what's just a naturally moist climate, which is most of the Roman Empire. In Egypt, you have parts of Egypt where it's very dry, and so where it's very dry, papyrus will naturally last a lot longer, and that's why it has lasted. In some cases, the papyrus lasted up to the present day. In the case of about 140 or so ancient papyri, and most of those are very small scraps, but about less than 15 are significant copies. And so we see something from Egypt that we can't really see from other locales, because in other locales it was not that dry and papyrus naturally rotted away. But as soon as you get to a stage in the transmission stream where it wasn't there wasn't a built-in factor that would rule against natural decay of papyrus, and we have manuscripts instead being written on parchment, because Christianity is no longer being constantly persecuted. In the 300s, when we look at those other areas, when we look at guys in Turkey, in Greece, in Syria, what kind of text were they using? Well, they were using primarily a Byzantine form of the text. It wasn't exactly like that we see the Byzantine text today when we look at the majority text, but it was a text that's a lot more Byzantine than it was anything else. And so the idea is that in those areas, either one of two things happened. Either Hort is right or Hort is wrong. And if Hort is right, then what happened is somebody around the year 300, a little bit before, a little bit less, somebody made a new edition of the New Testament and gave it, and everybody liked it and started using it just like that. Or the people there simply kept on using the text that they had been using all along. Every now and then, there'd be a visitation and an invasion, so to speak, and we might have a reading from Alexandria, into the text stream in Byzantium or in Syria or in that area. But the idea that the copyists and the bishops of the churches were very vigilant. We have an example of a guy named Spiridon, and he's kind of famous to the extent he's mentioned in the original preface to the King James Version. There's a reference made to him that one day he was at a gathering of bishops, and there was another bishop there telling the story about how Jesus saw the man who was being brought by his friends on a mat to be healed by Jesus. Well, the man that was telling the story used a different word for mat. We might say mattress and he might say cot. Not a big difference in the meaning, just a difference in the form of the word. But Spiridon stood up and said, "That's not how it goes. Use the right word." And so if you have guys like Spiridon as an example of how meticulous the people were and how they guarded the text, because this was the text that some of their forefathers had given their lives to protect, the probabilities, I would say, lie in favor of the idea that the Byzantine text did not just pop up out of nowhere around the year 300, but was simply a form of the text that had always been used there since there was a text, and simply came to the forefront, came to be manifested in copies because all the previous copies had been made of papyrus and had naturally rotted away. So that's the approach that I would use for that. But as far as the Alexandrian text being corrupt in a moral sense, or rendering some deviant text in some way, there's really only a few passages where I would say possibly the Alexandrian text does have some signs of doctrinally motivated corruption. One is in Matthew 27, verse 49, and we're not really sure why this happened, but it appears to be not exactly a doctrinal corruption, but something in the liturgy happened that got a piece of the Gospel of John thrown into Matthew. And we see this in later manuscripts where the story of Jesus praying in the garden and sweating sweat like blood. We see that in copies of Matthew. In copies of Matthew 102. Excuse me, time out. But in Matthew 27, verse 49, in the Alexandrian manuscripts, and also in some of the earlier Latin manuscripts from the insular manuscripts of Ireland, we have this reading that says that Jesus, as he cried out, the famous phrase, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," the Roman soldiers are like saying, "Oh, he's calling for Elijah. Let's see if Elijah will come save him." But then the text in the Alexandrian manuscript says in verse 49, and another one came and pierced him, and took a spear and pierced his side, and blood, and water and blood flowed forth. Now that's right before he died. Meanwhile, if you look in John's account, John 19 very clearly says that they didn't. Very clearly says that when they pierced him, it was to make sure he was already dead. And once again, we see blood and water flowing forth from the wound. Now, somebody might say, "Oh, maybe both things are true." But then you got, really? You think blood and water flowed out twice from a wound in the side? So clearly this is some kind of. Nobody's really nailed it down to say this is what happened for sure, but it looks like there was some kind of Easter time liturgy that got garbled in the Alexandrian text. But if you were to take the Alexandrian text as it stands and use that as the basis for your English translation, you would definitely have a chronological error, a contradiction between Matthew and John in your text. Now, some folks would say, well, inerrancy is just a minor doctrine, or it's a peripheral doctrine, no big deal. I think Dan Wallace would be prone to express that kind of thought. But if inerrancy is a big deal, and to some people it is a big deal, it's kind of a big deal to me. Then you would have a little bit of difficulty saying that no doctrine is affected by scribal variants, because, well, the doctrine of inerrancy, you only need one error to have an errant text. And that would be one if you were to adopt the Alexandrian text as it stands. Another difficulty is in Mark chapter 6, verse 22, where the question is, whose daughter was the dancer? Now, the daughter in tradition is known as Salome, or Salome, and Herodias is a daughter. And Matthew clearly says this is the daughter of Herodias, and Mark also says it's the daughter of Herodias. But in the Alexandrian text of Mark, it says it's Herod's daughter, who then is somehow also looks to Herodias for advice, and is referred to her as her mother. But Mark, in the Alexandrian text, calls her Herod's daughter, but clearly she's not Herod's daughter, she's Herodias' daughter. So there again, I think you would have an example of a very questionable reading in the Alexandrian text. Now, you could say, well, again, that's just inerrancy. That's not really major. But when you have that statement, no major doctrine is affected by textual variance, who's deciding which doctrines are major? Is there a list somewhere of which doctrines are the minor doctrines? So that's something that you could perhaps, when it comes to zeroing in, that claim has to be focused. It has to be clarified of what exactly is being meant by that. But when somebody says no important doctrinal variant is affected by a textual variant, when you zoom in on it, they probably mean no doctrine that I really care a lot about is affected by textual variants.
Yeah.
If you look at the Synodic Syriac in Matthew 1:16, the virgin birth is kind of affected by that textual variant. How can you say no doctrine is affected by any textual variant? You have to be more precise than that. You have to say no major doctrine is affected by any viable variant that could be the original text. Codex K in the Old Latin text is probably the worst written manuscript of any kind in any language, and I really doubt if anybody that makes that claim of no doctrinal variant is affected by a textual variant, I seriously doubt if any one of them would be comfortable reading Codex K of the Old Latin as their Bible.
So, James, what do you think of, sorry if this is a little bit off topic, but what do you think of that claim that there was a corruption in the manuscript line? Is there any evidence for that? Like, I'm sure you've heard Jack Mormon talk about that the Alexandrian manuscript was corrupted at some point in history. Like, is there actual evidence for that, or is there more evidence, like you were leaning, like it was just scribal errors and stuff like that? Like, I don't know. They hold pretty strongly to this idea. Like, a lot of them, like that Jack Mormon guy, seems like a pretty smart older guy. Like, I don't understand. Like, this is like a major thing, and some of them seem like good people. Like, I don't understand how someone could be so, I don't want to say the word brainwashed, but brainwashed by like a 16th century English text, or 17th century, sorry.
Jack Mormon, if it's the same Jack Mormon I think you're talking about, is a very strong proponent of the King James Version. Yeah. And I think he might be echoing some things that were written by earlier writers when it comes to that question that I mentioned before about, do you attribute to villainy what can be attributed to stupidity? That can be chalked up to accident. So one passage that comes up a lot is in John chapter 1, verse 18, where there's this phrase, Jesus being the only begotten God. Now sometimes the article is not there, and it's just only begotten God, and that is used by some of the Valentinians, Auxentius, an Arian in the early church. He used this phrase. Now, perfectly Orthodox people used it too, but when the bad guys used it, they meant it to mean that Jesus was the only begotten God, but kind of a small g, not too far from what the Jehovah's Witnesses teach. And so they would say, well, he's God in the sense that he's not human, he's the first created thing, but he's not. He's still part of this creation in some sense. And so that phrase is probably was used with doctrinal nuances in the early church. For Jesus as God and for Jesus as small g God, as angel, or aeon. But in the text, it's just a matter of one letter. The name, the words for Son and the word for God were both what was called nomina sacra, or nomen sacrum, which was a sacred name. And these were terms that, in the copying tradition, as far back as we can see it, these words were treated specially. They were contracted, so you would only write basically the first letter, or the first two letters, and then the final letter to show what the tense was, and while the mood. Anyway, but they were written in contracted form. So all you would need to do was get one letter wrong, and they would change their meaning entirely from Son to God. And at my blog, I've written about this particular passage in some detail. So you can go to the textofthegospels.com and just type in the search bar John 1:18. I'll go to curtisvillec.com and look for the textual criticism resources, and look for John 1:18, and that list will get you to the beginning of the where I focus on that. But there are other cases, for instance, in Vaticanus, where I think it's in Romans, where Romans 1:16, where the gospel is sent forth to the Jew first and also to the Greek. But is the word first in there? Well, if you're a Marcionite, the word first isn't in there, because the Marcionites didn't believe that the real God had sent the law to the Jews. And so there's readings pop up in the Alexandrian text here and there. I think there's one in 1 Peter 1 verse 10, another one that had an impact on the New World Translation, where it comes to is the word Spirit, Holy Spirit, in there, or is that reference just to the human spirit? So there are some readings in the Alexandrian text that tend to lend themselves to a more Arian source kind of thinking. In Vaticanus, when we look at how the copyist treated references to the Holy Spirit, usually Holy Spirit was one of those sacred names because it referred to deity. Like when we see the name David, when we see the name man, those are included as sacred names because they're part of divine titles, the Son of David, the Son of Man. But we see references to the Spirit in Codex Vaticanus. Often we don't see it being contracted like we see the other sacred names being contracted. So possibly the copyists of Vaticanus were more like what we would call a binitarian rather than trinitarian. And then this is, be aware, I'm speculating on this point. I can't read the minds of the copyist any more than I can read the mind of Norman Geisler. But it kind of looks that way, just in the way they treated the text. But as far as what readings do you have in the Alexandrian text that are corrupt to the point of changing the message, besides the omissions that can be easily attributed to accidents, we don't see a whole lot. So I would, in almost every case, with very few exceptions, I would say that the readings that Jack Mormon and some others are attributing to villainy, I would attribute to accident. I think.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I was muted. Yeah. So you think it's an accident? Yeah, me too. I know some people go pretty far down that rabbit hole. Here's kind of an off-topic question for you, if you don't mind. Have you ever heard of sinless perfectionism? That's kind of what the chat's kind of blowing up with right now. There's a big argument going off in that.
I have, yes.
What do you think of that? The idea that as long as you believe in Jesus and nothing you do is a sin, and once you're saved, you can't sin anymore. Even if you commit acts that are bad, it's not really a sin, because that's kind of what they believe.
Well, I know the belief is out there. I don't think it's ever been a standard consensus. Like you could look at the church councils and say this was affirmed to this council or that council.
Well, it's actually been a heresy for quite a long time.
But I like to look at the example of St. Paul, who said, as he was writing Romans, he could say things like, "Oh, wretched man that I am." Mm-hmm. And there was very, very much the sense where he's still, even though he's saved, he knows he's heaven bound, but he's still acutely aware of his moral shortcomings. That he's not the St. Paul that that would have been there if he had not sinned.
A lot of Romans I heard was actually about his battle with sin through life.
Yeah, and also in at one point, and especially he says, "No, I haven't arrived there yet, but I keep on pressing on." Now, if a person keeps on pressing on for the upward call, that means you're still running the race. It's after you've set back down and you're getting your water and making sure your calves don't cramp up. That's what happens after the race is done. But as long as we're still running the race, then we're still running the race, and that means we haven't arrived yet. So I think that's the case where Paul's statement, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall, because there were probably lots of people back in the wilderness with Moses thinking, well, now we've arrived, but they haven't really arrived because the carcasses fell in the wilderness. So I would say it's kind of perhaps a sign of inexperience where somebody just doesn't know themselves as well as they think they do. So I think many cases of that have come and gone when people got better acquainted with themselves. That's my general approach.
I get where they're coming from and everything, but like I just think it's kind of I don't want to. This is going to start a whole thing in the chat right now. They've already been debating each other in the chat for like an hour, but I think if you believe that you can, like, I'm not saying you're going to do bad things, but they believe that nothing they do on this earth is a sin. That to me, that's just like, I don't know. That's kind of like a deception. What better of a deception would it be for Satan to convince you that you can do anything you want, and it's not, in the eyes of Jesus, it's not a sin, right? Like, it's said in the last days many would be deceived, and I just think sinless perfectionism, well, it's been a heresy of the church for a long time. I know that doesn't matter to most people, but it just seems like you have nothing better to strive for in your life if you think you're already perfect. And in the Bible, the only sinless person was Jesus, wasn't it?
Yes. The only sinless person in the Bible was Jesus.
So,
now you could probably make an argument that babies, when they're in a state of innocence, they haven't acted on anything, they haven't made any decision to commit a sin. You can say they are judicially considered innocent, although there's a federal sense and corporate headship comes into play and all this sort of thing. But as far as the concept of I am sinless, I'm not sure. And again, I can't read their minds, but I would be very cautious about somebody taking risks on that premise of saying, well, I can't sin. I just can't. It's guaranteed that I can't sin. Therefore, I can take all these moral risks, and later on it turns out, well, guess what? I've sinned. Surprise.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know. Like, I think you should just try to, like Jesus, it said you should be walking in the light after he walked in the light, right? Like, so the thing is, what does that mean to someone? What is walking in the light, like after Jesus walked in the light, like following his examples? So if we're supposed to do that, then it gives you an example of how you're supposed to act pretty much in this world. It's not like he didn't come down and say, well, you can do whatever you want, you can party, you can get drunk, you can whatever, as long as you believe in my name, I took away all your sins, so nothing you do from now on is ever a sin. Like, I just don't, to me, that's just, I don't know, it just doesn't seem right to me, you know?
Yeah, well,
so,
also we should bear in mind that God sees in ways that we don't see. We see, the future that we can see, but our vision is limited by all kinds of things. That's our perspective. God sees things from the perspective of eternity, and often expresses himself, and sometimes expresses his perspective in that way. But for a person to say, "Well, I can't sin now," that's I think if you look historically at people, lots of people have said that, and lots of people have subsequently fallen because of overconfidence. But and that put them on the path toward that overconfidence, this assumption. But without any specifics, I can't really tell exactly how far and what direction to go from there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Sorry to ask you. I mean, that's just what the chat's been going off about for a while. So it's I don't know why. It's because we had a debate on the channel a few days ago, and one of the people that these guys follow, called the Preacher, was on here debating Melvin, actually, and I guess the chat kind of got fired back up about that. But yeah, man.
Okay, well, getting back to textual criticism.
Yeah, for sure.
It's sometimes said that in footnotes that none of the early manuscripts have this passage, and I'd like to point out that.
Which passage are we talking about, just to clarify?
Mark 16:9-20.
Okay, the same passage as Mark 16:9.
And Codex C has the passage. Now, Codex C is a palimpsest, and so to see the text that was.
What's a palimpsest? What's a palimpsest?
I'm glad you asked that question. Let me tell you about palimpsest.
Okay.
A palimpsest is a manuscript with recycled parchment. It's somebody made a parchment manuscript, but somebody else later on in the same place needed some parchment. There was a shortage of parchment, and they had this old book, and they said, well, we don't know exactly why they would do this. Maybe they had lots of copies of the Gospels and say, well, nobody's going to miss just one copy, and so we'll use that one. Or maybe they had a copy of the Gospels in a different language and said, well, nobody speaks that language anymore. Give me that. We'll use that copy. But what they did was they took the old manuscript, took it apart, and washed all the ink off its page. Or at least that's what they tried to do. And then with that nice, clean-looking page, they would reuse the parchment and write something else.
So that's called a palimpsest.
Time, the ink came back to the surface because they couldn't really wash it off entirely. The ink of certain kinds of ink would just be ingrained with the material, and so with effort we can read the old text that's written underneath the newer text. Codex C, that's why it's called Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, because the sermons of Saint Ephraim are written on top of an old Bible, but by looking at it very carefully, and in the old days they would use chemicals for this, but nowadays we have more sophisticated methods. But we read Codex C and see that Mark 16:9-20 is there. Likewise, Codex D, Codex Beza, which represents the Western text. Not the same form of the text, it's not the Byzantine form, but it's distinctly Western form of the text of Mark 16:9-20 is there in Beza, but it's damaged. It's not all there. The last page of Codex Beza is there, but it's there up to verse 15. So from Mark 16:9 through most of verse 15 is there, which implies
Codex Beza. You might have to explain some of this. Like, I just want everything clear. What's Codex Beza?
Codex Beza is an interesting copy, probably from the 400s. A researcher named D.C. Parker a few years back made a special study on Codex Beza, and he was of the opinion that it was from about the year 400. I would say that's a little bit too early, but
a codex is like a book, not a scroll.
Yeah, a codex is a handmade book. That's just what the word means.
Okay, so from like the 400s, like the 5th century, you think?
Yeah, 400s.
What was that other word?
Probably. Now, when I say from the 400s, I have to add the word probably because they're not like signed and dated. But it's probably from the 400s based on handwriting analysis. That's a specialized field called paleography. The paleographers in the 1800s used to say, it's probably from the 500s, maybe 600s. But the more it's been looked at, the earlier it tends to get assigned to. So right now we're at 400. Maybe 50 years from now, the rate will go, and it'll be from the 300s.
Oh, nice.
Right now, D.C. Parker thinks that it's from about the year 400. I think it's from the later 400.
What did you call that manuscript again? A
Codex Beza. It's called
the one that was washed.
B-E-Z-A-E. And this is one that's online at the Oxford University.
No, not Codex Beza, James. What was the word for that reused manuscript?
B-E-Z-A-E. It's called Codex Beza because it's named after Theodore Beza, Codex Bezae, but it's owned by Theodore Beza back in the 1500s, and he bestowed it upon the university there. So they've had it since then, and it's one of the world's most studied manuscripts because its text is so strange. Because instead of displaying the later text, it displays the Western text, which, even though is not a very popular text in terms of the number of manuscripts, many of the patristic writers of the 2nd and 3rd century use one form or another of that form of the text. the Western text is what it's called, and it tends to, especially the Book of Acts, to expand the text for the reader. If there's a way to make an exaggeration, but it's one that gets the point across. Don't use one word when two words will do. That was kind of the Western way of doing things, of making things a little more flowery and a little more plain, to expand the meaning. And instead of saying Jesus, to say Jesus Christ. Instead of saying the Spirit, to say the Holy Spirit. Just spruce things up a little bit, a lot of the way through. That was the general tendency of the Western text, and that's what we see in Codex Beza, which means that if you compare your average Byzantine manuscript from the Middle Ages to the text of Codex Beza, even though Codex Beza is hundreds of years earlier, when you compare them to this modern compilation, the Byzantine manuscript will come out far better than the text of Codex Beza comes out. So you can't always go by age. We often think, well, earlier means better. Not in this case. And in the case of some of the papyri, not in that case. That is an assumption that should not be automatically assumed. It doesn't come down to which one's earliest. What it comes down to is how well did the copyists do their job.
Yeah.
If you have a very early manuscript, but the copyists didn't know what they were doing, and they
early kind of is important, right? Like you want to be able to trace back that manuscript line. If you have something from say you had something from the 5th century and something from the 2nd century, wouldn't you put more faith in this whatever's from the 2nd century? It's so close to the original. It's so close to the original authors, right?
You would think, of course, the earliest one is the better text because the copyists have had that much fewer opportunities to make mistakes.
Yeah,
that's the assumption that the writer of those footnotes is hoping the reader will have. When you see a note that says the earliest and the best manuscripts will have this reading instead of this reading, you think the average reader will read that and say, oh, the early manuscripts have this reading, so that one must be better. But when you look at the manuscripts and you do the close-up studies, you'll see manuscripts like Papyrus 46, Papyrus 66, compared to the same text, with the same passages that they have, comparing that to medieval average manuscripts. I've done individual studies where if you look at my blog and look for the term hand-to-hand combat, where the hand of one scribe is being compared to the hand of the other scribe, you can look at case after case where the average medieval manuscript has the text that's better than the text that's in the earlier papyri, or the early manuscript like Codex Beza. And the standard for that isn't the Byzantine text. Now, if I were to use the Byzantine text as my standard, it would be even more lopsided in favor of the medieval text. But using this as a standard of comparison, you will still find the medieval manuscript will have a much better text than almost all of the early papyri, the substantial ones, in certain sections. And I've done that over and over again. And 10 out of 11 times, the medieval manuscript has the better text. Again, using Nestle-Aland as the standard of comparison. If I were to use the Byzantine text over there as a standard of comparison, it'd be far more lopsided in favor of the medieval manuscript. So it's not really an accurate assumption, even though it sounds reasonable to say, well, earlier must be better, but not really, because it comes down to how careful were the copyists. All you need is one lousy copyist, and the guy before him might be great, the guy after him might be great, but if you have one copyist in the middle who's terrible, who's barely literate, that line can be corrupted very quickly.
Well, that's like, how would you know though? Like if you had something from the 5th century and you say it's better than something that comes from the 2nd century, like how would you know that it even goes back that far if you don't have anything?
Knowing that it goes back that far is a matter of dating a particular manuscript. Lots of things can go into that. Paleography is one, just the shape of the letters. Sometimes on the front of a manuscript there'll be one writing and a different manuscript on the back side, where a parchment has been reused on two different sides. In that case, you'd have what had been a scroll, but sometimes on that backside that might be simply an ordinary document that will have a date on it. It doesn't happen very often. In other cases, there'll be places where a manuscript was positioned, and where we find the manuscript has an impact on how we date the manuscript. For instance, if a manuscript is inside a wall of a city that we know was destroyed in a certain year, we can probably safely say, well, that's from the year that the city was destroyed. That kind of thing also doesn't happen very often. So usually it's paleographically assigned dates. But once you have a paleographically assigned date, and for most of the papyri and in the early manuscripts, that's what we've got. In most of those cases, once you've got the manuscript in your hands or on your table, and you're looking at how can we analyze these readings from these rival readings over here, that's where the canons come into play. Making a canon or a guideline of textual criticism goes back to a guy named Johann Bengel. But even before him, way back in the early church, guys like Irenaeus would say, well, what about the line of manuscripts that we have? Do we know where these manuscripts came from? Are they approved by people in the early church? So that was part of Irenaeus' approach, and he would also value in the year 180. He would also prove the earlier manuscripts, but we're talking less than 80 years from the writing of the Book of Revelation. But one point to consider is: do we have old evidence for reading? There are some readings that we have in the TR that simply don't have old evidence. It's not like we don't have old evidence here or more old evidence there, but we don't have any old evidence. For instance, Acts chapter 9, verses 5 through 6. It's in the King James, but it's not in any Greek New Testament manuscript that wasn't made from a printed form of the text.
Which verse is that?
Acts chapter 9, verses 5 through 6, especially verse 6. This part of that passage is basically taken from the Vulgate, and also it's something that Erasmus threw in there to parallel the Vulgate text that he had. But when we look at the manuscripts, it's simply not there. What's happened is that he's made a harmonization to the other two places in Acts where we do have that scene recurring.
Acts 9, 5 to 6, right?
Yeah. So it's a true statement of what happened, but it doesn't really belong in Acts chapter 9. It belongs in the other two places in the book of Acts.
I'm going to share my screen. I'll read it out real quick. Acts chapter 9, verse 5 to 6, this one right here. And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And
the part about the goads. It's hard for you to prick against the goads, which is kind of expression like what a cow on a narrow pathway. The shepherd would have this sharp stick, and he'd push the cow forward, or the animal forward, not be a goat or a sheep, and the animal would resist, and that way and it would prick the animal, and so that's why naturally the animal would keep going forward. But Paul, it was like he was resisting the clear evidence that he was being given, and until he got this miraculous vision on the road to Damascus. And so there's that saying, which is part of the account, but it's part of the account that we see in the other passages in Acts. It doesn't belong there in chapter 9.
Well, that's like the communal hominion or whatever they call it, right? In the King James.
That's another example in 1 John chapter 5, and this is another a passage where if you go online to CurtisvilleCC.com and go to the page about textual criticism resources, there's just scroll on down till you find 1 John 5:7. Click on that, and there's several different resources about this particular passage and the evidence that pertains to it.
The one that says there are three that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But isn't that's not found in like any manuscript before the 12th century, isn't it?
Well, in the Latin manuscripts, it
sounds like a later edition that you can totally tell.
Because there's a lot of controversy, it's important to define our terms. We say manuscript, let's say, when we say manuscript, we're always going to mean Greek manuscript. In that sense, right.
Yeah.
In Latin, it's a different story. The passage probably began as a gloss on what we know as 1 John 5 verse 8, talking about those witnesses there, what we know as the earthly witnesses, which involves the spirit, the water, and the blood. In the early form of the African Old Latin text, those witnesses were transposed, so that water came first, then blood, then spirit. In that particular order, it's kind of rules out the carpet for a person who likes allegories to say, well, that kind of represents the Trinity. The God the Father in the Old Testament in Jeremiah says, I am the fountain of waters. Jesus obviously would bring the blood, and the Spirit is the Spirit. So the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. When the words are transposed to verse 8, what we know as verse 8, when those terms are transposed, that is the trigger to bring in the interpretation of what somebody thought these words meant. But when we see in other translations and other of the early versions that aren't Latin, we don't see those words transposed, and we don't see the gloss either, because the gloss was provoked by the transposition. So in the African Old Latin text, this eventually became a very popular passage. By the late Middle Ages, this is the standard form of the Vulgate. But it got into the Vulgate from the African Old Latin, and it got into the African Latin because it was seen as, how do you interpret those other three witnesses, the earthly witnesses?
African Old Latin.
The earthly witnesses, because the earthly and heavenly part, that's part of the gloss.
How far back does I've never even heard of African Old Latin manuscripts, texts?
Well, the African Old Latin is a form of the Old Latin text. Now, when I say Old Latin text, I'm talking about a version of the text in Latin, and there were several different versions of the New Testament in Latin. Some more complete than others, and they might all go back to one common version. But if so, they got very diverse very quickly. And in the form of Latin that was used in Africa, a guy named Cyprian used it in the middle of the 200s. And at one point in one of his writings, he and again, for details, see the blog post about that. In one of Cyprian's writings, he mentions that the scripture talks about the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and says these three are one. And the question is he quoting something, or is he making an allusion to an allegory? And I would say that he's making an allegory here. To a person who just steps in and looks at it, it looks like, oh, of course he's quoting. But when you look at the details of his text and the text that was used by other writers at his time, for instance, in the work of De Baptismate, which quotes the same passage but doesn't have the passage, doesn't have the gloss, that is, then you can see, putting two and two together, what has apparently happened in that particular line. Because when we look at the Syriac text, we look at the Sahidic text, we look at the other forms of the text in other languages, we simply don't see that verse. We also don't see the transposition, at least we don't see it as readily and as widespread as we do in that particular form of the text. When you look down at the Old Latin line, the more it spread, eventually it got to Rome, to Cassiodorus. He also quotes the Comma Johannine, but he also has the transposition. So it doesn't take a great stretch to see how the transposition leads to the allegorical interpretation, and that's where this reading comes from. That's where this reading comes from, but it comes in Latin. It doesn't really appear in Greek until you get much later on in Greek manuscripts, where there begin to be Greek manuscripts that are trying to be made with the Greek on one side and the Latin on the other, and somebody tries to line them up. They get to 1 John 5:7 where they don't line up, and they say, well, I'll just translate the Latin and put that into the Greek. And that's what we see in the few manuscripts where we do have it in the Greek text. And you can discern that, by the way, by looking for the Greek articles. And again, the resources online just walk you through the evidence, where you can see from the lack of the articles in Latin, you don't see them in Greek, where you have it being translated from Latin. So does that help with that one? You can see see in the early Latin text, it was But by the late 400s, the Comma Johannine was somewhat popular. There was a sort of a council that wasn't really an official council, as it was more like a conference between one of the Vandal kings, and the Vandals were Arians. The Vandals were sweeping across North Africa, and they wanted to kind of flex the muscle against the more orthodox Christians in the area. And so they said, well, let's have a meeting at Carthage, and we'll talk theology. And so the leaders of the African Orthodox Church began to get together, and their leader Eugenius prepared a manuscript, a statement that he was intending to present at that council. Now the council very quickly, almost as soon as it got started, got bogged down in technicalities. But in the manuscript that Eugenius had prepared, he quoted the Comma Johannine. He even said, "This is something that really we need to really point out to those Arians." But outside the old Latin line, we don't see the Comma Johannine. We see the text without that passage, because it originated as a gloss, as an interpreted allegory of what we see as verse 8. Now I say what we see as verse 8 because in some of the earliest Latin manuscripts, verse 7 and verse 8 are switched around, so they didn't really have the numbers beside the verses back then, and in some of those manuscripts, verse 8 comes before the Comma Johannine. So, any other passages or other questions about Mark 16:9-20? Because really, I'm just it might sound like I've said a lot about it, but really I'm just scratching the surface of things like the patristic evidence.
I'm just amazed with how much you know, man. How long have you been doing this for?
Was there anything else that you wanted to cover?
Can you do
one claim that gets thrown around a lot is the claim that Origen and Clement know nothing of these verses. I think I started writing about this particular subject in 2007. Now, I've done quite a bit of research on it before that, but in 2007, I turned 40, and I thought, well, now that I'm 40, I'll start to write a few things.
And what's your... Sorry, I think there's a bit of a delay. I think you have a bit of a delay.
You're kind of coming and going.
Yeah. I think there's a delay.
I can't quite hear you right now, but I was about to say that the claim often comes up because it comes up by Bruce Metzger's textual commentary that Clement and Origen show no knowledge of these verses.
There we go. That's better.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, that's better. Can you hear me now?
But
can you hear me? Check.
I'm going to work on the premise that unless you wave your hands wildly, I can keep going.
No, keep going.
The claim is often made that Clement and Origen show no knowledge of Mark 16:9-20, and that claim is often received as if it means something, as if it means that Clement must quote from the Gospel of Mark a whole lot, but then all of a sudden we have no quotations from Mark 16:9-20. In real life, Clement hardly never uses the Gospel of Mark except for chapter 10. Yes.
There's a massive delay. You should try maybe rejoining. No.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. There's just a huge delay on your end.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, you're waving your hand.
No.
Okay. So Clement is oftentimes presented as if when he doesn't use Mark 16:9-20, it must mean that he didn't have it in his manuscript. That's the implication. But that implication isn't really justified because Clement does not use Mark chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 9, chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 16. In every one of those chapters, in every chapter except for chapter 10, Clement does not use huge pieces of Mark, and yet we don't draw the assumption that, well, his copy of Mark must have just been missing those parts. It's just simply a matter of Clement really liked the other Gospels better, and that's what he tends to quote from more. So, and Origen, in one of Origen's compositions, and it was a rather heavily edited work of Origen called Philokalia, chapter 5, there's a reference in Philokalia where it sure does look like Origen is using what appears to be making use of Mark 16:9 through 20. It's not a quotation, but he definitely does seem to be aware of the contents of those verses in Philokalia chapter 5, book 5. So there are, and we go into a little more detail, but I'll avoid going into the tall grass. But that claim is often abused to the point of, encouraging or eliciting an assumption that it really shouldn't elicit. Westcott and Hort was a lot more candid about, this can be observed, but it really doesn't mean anything. But when you look at Metzger's book and how Metzger's data has been used, it tends to be used almost as if the writer Origen and Clement didn't have it, whereas really what we have is just an example of the sparseness of our evidence from these two particular writers. Look at other writers in the early church, guys like Tertullian, Hippolytus, Vincentius, the source material of Acts of Pilate, Fortunatianus. That's, by the way, a new one that was just discovered within the past 7 years. Ambrose of Milan quotes from Mark 16:9 to 20 over and over again. This is the Bishop of Milan, a major city, a major bishop, major writer, and he has no qualms about using Mark 16:9 to 20. One more thing that's interesting about Ambrose is he shows in his writings that he had read Eusebius's work Ad Marinus, and yet he is wide open about his use of Mark 16:9 to 20. Now, in Ad Marinus, it's an interesting composition. If anybody wants to read Ad Marinus directly, go to Roger Pierce's website, or simply look for the name Roger Pierce Eusebius. Just run a search, and you will probably very easily find the work Eusebius of Caesarea, Gospel Problems and Solutions, and you can download that for free. A major, significant patristic work that anybody can have access to now in Greek and in English and in some other languages. But Eusebius was writing this series of gospel problems and solutions, and his correspondent, Marinus, at one point asked him, how do you harmonize what we know as Matthew 28:2 and Mark 16, verse 9? Well, in Eusebius' answer, he says, well, there's two ways a person might go about this. A person could say that passage where it's mentioned that Jesus rises on the first day of the week, it could be said that this is not in every manuscript. It's in some manuscripts, but it's not in others. Or it seldom appears. Or it's not in most of the manuscripts. And so a person could simply dismiss the passage on the grounds that it's not in most of the manuscripts. But somebody else who simply receives the text that is handed down to him, however it got there, could say that you shouldn't just pick and choose which text to receive, and that person would simply pronounce the text with a pause and thus resolve the apparent contradiction. Put a pause there in Mark 16, verse 9, and that's how you pronounce the words. So that's what you would do. And Eusebius just commends to Marinus the use of Mark 16:9, even though he says that somebody could say that it's not in all the manuscripts, or that it seldom appears in some of the manuscripts. So his statement is actually kind of nuanced, where he says somebody could say this, but in the composition, that's not what Eusebius himself says. He frames it as something that somebody could say. Also, later on in the same composition, Eusebius mentions Mark 16:9. He mentions Mary Magdalene. He mentions Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, out of whom Jesus had cast out 7 devils. So Eusebius uses that verse from Mark 16, in Mark 16, verse 9, later on in his own composition. So at the time that Eusebius writes Ad Marinum, it looks like he was fully willing to have Marinus accept the passage, and that's the course of action that he recommends. Now later on, Jerome, in one of his writings called Ad Hedibia, sometimes Jerome is treated and presented as if he's an independent writer. But what's really going on is Jerome, in writing in Latin in the early 400s, is answering a question from Hadibia, but saving himself some time by saying, hey, wait a minute, Eusebius answered a very similar question. I'm just going to borrow Eusebius's work and translate Eusebius's Greek and abridge it and put it in Latin. So in Eusebius's composition that he writes to Hadibia, when he gets to this question, he repeats the same things that Eusebius had said. He says, well, we could say this on these grounds, and it's hardly ever there in the Greek manuscripts. But then Jerome, just like Eusebius had in Ad Merim, goes on to commend the passage and recommends to Hadibia how to pronounce it, how to use it, how to read it. So Jerome also, now by this time Jerome's made the Vulgate, in which he includes Mark 16:9-20. So what's oftentimes presented in commentaries as if it's a statement by Eusebius isn't really Eusebius making a plain observation, but Eusebius saying somebody could say that it's not in most manuscripts. Somebody could say it seldom appears. But in the actual context, there's more to the picture. Eusebius commends the inclusion of the passage to Marinus. And likewise, in the case of Jerome and Hadibia, Jerome is simply abridging what Eusebius had written 100 years before. And we can see this plainly because the questions that Jerome is answering are the same questions that Marinus was asking back in the composition that Eusebius wrote. So these are not two independent compositions. Jerome is echoing Eusebius, and Jerome is anticipating that Hadibia will include the passage. And Jerome himself included the passage not only in the Vulgate, but later on when he was writing the work against the Pelagians, he mentions the interpolation that we know as the Phreologion. He doesn't quote it in quite the same form that we have it in Codex W, the only manuscript that's extant where it appears, but it's recognizably the same passage. And he says this is sometimes found, and then he quotes Mark 16 verse 14, and right after that is of course where it's found in Codex W. But he expects his readers to know where this interpolation is found. It's taken for granted that Mark 16:14 is in their manuscripts. Likewise, Augustine, in his writings, he's a Latin writer, but in the course of his comments, he mentions his Greek manuscripts that have Mark 16 verse 12, and he points out a little grammatical point, a little linguistic point from his Greek manuscripts that have Mark 16 verse 12. Other writers, Epiphanius, also uses Mark 16 verses 9-20. The old Latin chapter summaries, and some of these go back to the time of Cyprian, to the 2nd century. The old Latin chapter summaries also use Mark 16:9-20. They say, after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to the apostles and said, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, the unbeliever shall be damned, and the Lord was received into heaven. So clearly the chapter summary is using a form of the text in Latin that includes Mark 16:9-20. Likewise, the work that's called the Doctrine of Adai, from around the year 400, but it uses sources that were earlier. It's got it in there too. Pelagius quotes it. So there's not only in the Orthodox or the ordinary church, but also the people that were kind of on the edges, they have it too. Enoch of Gold, way out in Armenia, he quotes Mark 16, 17-18 very loosely, but he's got it. And the Armenian copies, some of them, it's often said, don't include Mark 16:9-20. Well, that's certainly true, but an even bigger amount of Armenian manuscripts do include it. But these copies in Armenian are late compared to Enoch of Gold. Enoch of Gold was in the 400s. You've got to go quite a number of centuries later before you get to copies in Armenian at all of Mark chapter 16. Also, Marcus Aramida. Marcus Aramida is not a well-known writer, but he quoted Mark 16:18. Nestorius. And then after that, in Latin, after the mid-400s or so, you're getting into more of a use of the Vulgate. And so all the writers after that would be just repetitions of the Vulgate. So we have a big pile of Vulgate manuscripts, but that boils down to Jerome's own sources. But later writers also in Greek continue to use Mark 16:9-20. In the lectionary, where the readings were organized for church use day by day, the Mark 16:9-20 was used on Ascension Day, so there was no doubt of how prominent it was. It was a very prominent reading. It was also one of one of the 11 Hiothina readings, which appear in many lectionaries near the end as readings to especially focus on when you're thinking about the rising of Jesus. And so in many manuscripts, ordinary manuscripts, not just lectionary manuscripts, but in continuous text manuscripts, in the margins, you often see these specially noted with a little abbreviation in the margin that'll somewhere say Hiothina, and in Matthew it'll be A, which would be number 1, and then in Mark number 2 that ends at verse 8, and then Hiothina reading number 3, that's Mark 16, 9 through 20. And so we see that in manuscript after manuscript after manuscript, but you have to know what to look for. I don't think I've ever seen a commentary where the commentator shows that he's well enough acquainted with the manuscripts to point out that this is a reading that's noted in one manuscript after another in the margins. So when you know what to look for, and you look at the patristic evidence, at the scope of the evidence, when we have it all over the Roman Empire, we see the shorter ending appearing for a brief time in Egypt, but almost as soon as it's there, the usual 12 verses show up too. And that's why we see in every manuscript in Greek that has the shorter ending also has verses 9 through 20, or at least the manuscript itself might be damaged and thus not have the ending pages, but it has at least verse 9 to show what it was like when it was in pristine condition. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some notes in those Greek manuscripts too, and again, not to go into the fine details of the case, but in one of those notes, it mentions that some copies in the text at the end of verse 8, some end with the shorter ending, and some end with verses 9 to 20. That's just one little brief window that we see, but it's specific to the locale of Egypt. Everywhere else where we look, we see the usual 12 verses, especially at Rome. That's where the text began.
You know what?
Does anybody have any other questions?
James, I would absolutely love to see you in a debate.
Why did I leave out 7 and 8?
Oh, they're
is that back on the Comma Johannine?
No, I think they're
something for convenience.
I think they're still talking about sinless perfectionism. Yes. There's a bit of a delay, but I would love to see you in a debate.
You're not the only one.
Yeah, you should debate sometime. I'd have it on my channel. You should debate something sometime. Be sweet. You're a beast, man. You know so much. It's crazy. You'd be so good at it.
I think somebody had a question about the book.
Sorry, you cut out. Question about what? Oh, here.
I think somebody had a question about the book of Enoch. I think Oleg there means Enoch, the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch is referenced. I think Oleg's question. He says, "I have a question about the book of Enoch, but I think you mean Enoch, the book of Enoch." Now, the book of Enoch is a composite work. Jude refers to it, and he actually quotes from Enoch. I think it's verse 15, where it talks about the Lord will send judgment down, and in the book of Jude. And the book of Enoch is a composite work. There are different layers to it. It was, I would say, it's kind of like a snowball that rolls down the hill, and as it gets rolling, it gets bigger. So you start out with a basic core, which is the narrative about Enoch with the fall of the Watchers, and the story of the Watchers, including the lead angel, the lead fallen angel called Semyaza, where Semyaza leads about 200 or so angels to fall to earth. And if you look at the background of Genesis chapter 6, you can see how this was interpreted as the sons of God being a reference to fallen angels. Enoch takes that concept and expands upon it. And the idea is that the sons of God, they see how humans can reproduce and they can't. And so there are different interpretations about this, but the one that I would prefer, the one I think is more viable overall, is that the fallen angels left the stations that were assigned to them and went down to where they could, in certain cases where people were prone to sin, take possession of people to an extent. And in that venue, they were able to have intercourse with humans. And so the Book of Enoch it says that basically after this had all happened, God sent Enoch to the fallen angels, or to the women, to the men that were possessed by the fallen angels, to announce a sentence of judgment upon them, that all their offspring were going to be wiped out, that all their influence that they had upon humanity was going to be totally exterminated. And that was Enoch's message to the fallen angels, or to the men that had been possessed by the fallen angels.
How far did
the fallen angels express a measure of regret? It doesn't come to a point of repentance, but they are looking for a place of repentance, but they're not finding any. And the fallen angels, or the men that were inhabited by the fallen angels, then perish in the flood. And so that's kind of an explanation for the flood. What was the flood intended to do? The flood wasn't intended to take away sin, because obviously there's still sin after the flood. But the purpose of the flood was to exterminate the influence of the fallen angels in the days of Enoch.
Better for me.
How far back does the Book of Enoch date? Good question. I would say it's at least as far back as the Dead Sea Scrolls, because we have some copies of Enoch among the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least of parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Wow, that's pretty far.
The Book of Enoch, like I said, is stratified, so some parts of it would be rather late. There's a book, kind of a primer by Mitchell Reddish, and yeah, it is largely as a lens of how people interpreted the story of Enoch and the story of Genesis chapter 6. But Mitchell Reddish has a great primer to the Book of Enoch and some other apocalyptic literature. And so I would say look in Reddish's book, and you'll probably find some sense that it's original to Enoch. I would say no. Enoch, including the part that Jude quotes, is lasted for a long time simply as an oral tradition, and an oral tradition is really all we need to have to get to some veracity behind the gist of what Jude is quoting. But the idea, though, that there were fallen angels who came down to earth, not necessarily in an incarnate form like they had physical bodies, but the idea of there being fallen angels is something we see referred repeatedly in 2 Peter. If you look at 2 Peter through the lens of the Book of Enoch, you can get a clearer idea, I think, of what Enoch of what Peter is talking about and some of the connections that he makes. So to have Enoch in view, I think is important for interpretation, but it doesn't require that we have the Book of Enoch in any sense that we consider the original Book of Enoch. There really is no original Book of Enoch that we can pick up anywhere on earth today.
We have a question from
Shiloh Knoll is saying, do I sin? Yes, it's I try not to make a habit of it, but yes, I do sin. I think we might be overlapping topics there.
Yeah. Can you hear me now, James, or is there still a really bad delay?
Anyone else have any other questions about the thing that we've been talking about for the past while?
Yeah, does anybody have any questions for James about any originality, manuscripts, text?
Nick, it kind of looks like the chat is going in a different direction. So,
yeah, okay.
Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss about Mark 16:20?
For some reason, I'm having a hard time talking to you. There's a really bad delay with our connection. Like, can you hear me right now, or? It takes about 15 seconds for you to respond after I talk.
I'm waiting for the question.
I don't know why.
I hear you fine.
Okay. Yeah, I know there's no delay for the audience. It's just a delay when I talk. It takes about 10 seconds for James to hear me. So it's just... Angels and the Nephilim, also known as the Watchers. Calypso would like you to slow down. I guess he's got a lot to say and not long to say it. It's a man of knowledge here. You gotta listen
I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm just gonna wrap it up then, I guess.
Well, there's one more thing that I'd like to point out, which
sure,
is
buddy.
in Codex Sinaiticus.
Go ahead, bro.
Okay. Well, in Codex Sinaiticus, yeah, that's not anywhere close to what we were talking about. Enoch, part of the Book of Enoch, and not the main earliest strata of it, strata, but in Enoch, just to stay there for just a second before we jump back to the in Enoch, he goes through what's called a tour of the supernatural realm, and in this later section of Enoch, that he gets taken into the spirit realm and he sees the tree of paradise. He even smells the tree of paradise, and so. But this is all part of a later form of literature that was not anywhere close to the actual person Enoch, and the actual time is before Noah. All that would be part of oral tradition. So we're talking about the book and the tradition are two different things. Now, parts of that tradition, I think, were plugged into the text of the Book of Enoch that we see in the very earliest layer of it, but the later layers are clearly written by somebody that has nothing known as Enoch. So that probably shouldn't be too much. In other words, the tour of heaven might have a significance if somebody is talking about how did the Book of Enoch influence the thinking of, say, Muhammad when it came to what Muhammad thought he could get away with saying that he had seen in heaven. But for actual things in the Bible, it's a completely different genre than what we have in the text that we were discussing. In Codex Sinaiticus, getting back to the question of Mark 16:9-20, Codex Sinaiticus, even though you won't see this at the Codex Sinaiticus website, if you were to look at the end of the Gospel of John and put it under ultraviolet light, you would see something that Tischendorf, the guy that saw it at St. Catherine's Monastery, where it had been preserved for hundreds of years, something that Tischendorf had seen, that people weren't sure whether to believe him or not, until later on somebody actually did get an ultraviolet light and look at it with ultraviolet light. T.C. Skeet, one of the scholars that studied Codex Sinaiticus in the 1900s, found out that Tischendorf had been right about his suspicion, which was that in Codex Sinaiticus, toward the end of John, one verse before the end, the copyist didn't write the final verse. And if you look at the contents of not John, so even though the copyist had a copy of John, he was willing to omit the part that he didn't think, based on internal evidence, was not by John. So he closed the book out one verse early, wrote the closing title, made the little decorative design, and that was what he did until, for some reason, maybe the supervisor said, no, you're going to keep that verse after all. But he erased what he'd written, rewrote the text with that final verse, and that's what we see when we look at the text today. All that we have when it comes to Mark 16:9-20 is the same mechanism being used. A copyist who comes to the text thinking, we have this passage, but I don't think that it's original. It's in the text, but it's not by the main author. Therefore, let's leave it out. And so that's what we see with both Mark 16:9-20. We also see with John 21, verse 25 in Codex Sinaiticus, one of the two manuscripts in the early days that didn't have verses 9-20. In both of those manuscripts, we see clear signs that the copyists were aware of the absent verses. Oleg has another question about the Book of Thomas, asking, is that original? As a pseudepigraphical text, it would, by definition, not be original. That is, it's not original to the Apostle Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas, I'm going to assume, is what he's talking about. The Gospel of Thomas is not original to Thomas. It's what's called a pseudepigraphical work. In other words, in non-Christian groups that were not considered orthodox by those who upheld apostolic Christianity, in other words, real Christianity, they would often use the name of an apostle to title their book to give it a false veneer of authority. The thinking is that nobody cares about the gospel of John Smith from Egypt, who's just making things up. But if you give it an apostolic authority, it gives it a sort of a flair to say, oh, this is the book of Thomas. This is the gospel of Thomas we're talking about. And so forged manuscripts would develop. And that's what we see among the Nag Hammadi text, the text of the well, we might as well say, call them Gnostics, living in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, which is just, it's on a map. And so at Nag Hammadi and other areas, we see this sort of literature being used. Sometimes it's more subtle than in other cases. Sometimes in some of the Gnostic works, they talk about the body of Jesus being not really solid, about John being able to put his hand through the body and it wasn't really there. But in the Gospel of Thomas, it's mostly not so much a gospel as what we think of a gospel being, but as a collection of sayings. Some of those overlap sayings in the real Gospels, and lots of guys have lots of ink has been spilt looking into those parallels. But there's a quick and easy answer, which is that no, it's not an original to the Gospel of Thomas book. It's written by false teachers in the early 2nd century. Have I read the book of Jasher and 4th Esdras? 4th Esdras, yes. Jasher, it depends on if is it really the book of Jasher, or is it just what somebody is claiming the book of Jasher? I really need more information to know where that question's coming from. But that's not really the topic that we're focused on.
Book of Maccabees?
The books of the Maccabees, those are books that are in the apocryphal literature. The books of the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, are part of the apocryphal books that were written between the Testaments. In the Catholic tradition and in the Orthodox tradition, they're considered authoritative. Now, in my tradition, they're fine things to read, good for instructions in manners, but not really for the establishment of doctrine. They kind of have a secondary standing. And the authors themselves will say, when we wrote this, we didn't have prophets on hand. Now, I might be paraphrasing a bit. Feel free to clarify in the comments. But there is a secondary nature to those books that has long been understood ever since the days of Jerome and the Vulgate, where it's hard to say a book is authoritative when you can point out chronological mistakes in it. Say about in the book of Judith, for instance, with who's in charge of Babylon in the days of Judith, where are they? And you get into pretty big difficulties pretty quickly when it comes to the chronological difficulties in the book of Judith. Again, valuable to read, useful, but I wouldn't consider that an authoritative book, an authoritative text. Now, Maccabees is interesting for one other purpose that comes to mind, and that is in Mark chapter 9, verse 29, in the Alexandrian text, the reference to fasting is not there. Almost all manuscripts have it, but Vaticanus and Sinaiticus don't. Papyrus 45 is earlier than those, and it appears to have it. It's damaged, but if you look at it very carefully, I believe you'll be able to see reference to fasting in Papyrus 45. Now it's assumed by the advocates of the Alexandrian text that somebody was just throwing in references to fasting where they saw references to prayer, because the kind of go together like bacon and eggs, prayer and fasting. But I would propose that somebody in the Alexandrian transmission stream, and this might be one of those rare doctrinally influenced readings that we were talking about before, on rare occasions, doctrine does come into play. I would say that fasting was one of those areas where somewhere in Egypt, fasting was treated with is just treated very carefully. That we don't fast like the bad guys fast. We fast in our own days, our own ways, It's got to be on these particular days, and you've got to prepare for it and do it our way. So there was some resistance to fasting, and I think that affected the Alexandrian text. We see one example of this in First Maccabees, where there's a reference to fasting in the normal text of Maccabees, but in Sinaiticus, where it's supposed to say fasting, it says something else. So there's a reference there in Maccabees where the reference to fasting has been changed, which kind of tilts toward the view that if it was changed in Maccabees, it was changed in Mark. Especially when we have so many references to Mark 9:29 and to the parallel. I believe it's in Matthew 17:21, where we see these passages quoted, for instance, by Origen in the 200s, and very widely supported, except in the Alexandrian text. Anything else?
I just wish there wasn't. Can you hear me now, or is there still a mad delay?
I hear you.
Now you can. Okay, good, man. There was like a 15-second delay before when I tried to talk to you. That sucks.
Okay.
Now I can finally talk to you. Thanks for coming, man. Like, people really like you. I'm sorry that a lot of the chat was kind of off topic. They were all debating themselves about that whole sinless thing, but a lot of people really, really enjoyed you, and I would love to see you have a friendly debate sometime. You got to do that, James. You should. We should try and set you up a text. You'd be perfect at like a King James only or a textual criticism debate. Hey, what do you think about that?
I'd certainly consider it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try and find a good topic for you, and we'll see if you will agree to it. I have to find someone up to your talent. Can't just get anybody to debate you, so I'll have to try and find someone worthy of you. I'll see if I can put that together. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Snapp here before we wrap this up? Or is there anything else you would like to say, James, before we wrap this up, or anything like that?
Just that my
would you like me to put a link to a website, or do you have a blog or something that you write?
Yes, that's kind of what I was going to say. If you go to Amazon and look for my book,
let me do that
Authentic,
right now.
The Case for Mark 16:9-20.
Okay, I'm going to do that right now, and I'll put a link in the
It's
chat.
like 99 cents. So,
it's only 99 cents.
Hopefully it won't break the bank.
99 cents, you guys. Check it out. I'm gonna put a link to it right now, James. You can just, let's see, you talk about whatever you want while I find it on Amazon.
And if 99 cents is a challenge, just find me on Facebook and I'll give you a copy.
Oh, there you go, guys. Free copy if you can't pay 99 cents. What a guy. Okay, so what do I look for here, James, when I try to find your book? I'm on Amazon.
Just go to Amazon and just type in Authentic, The Case for Mark 16:9-20.
Authentic. Authentic. Oh, there it is. James Snapp Jr. Cool. 2016 edition. You have a couple of them. Wow. You got a few books here, James. You guys got to check this guy out. So when you guys check out,
there's also a Scholars edition that's a lot more expensive for those that.
Here's the one for 99 cents. Yeah, some of them are more.
For those that just want to give me money, there's also a Scholars edition that's $25.
Some of them are free on there. One of them's free, The Letter of James. Okay.
But they're both exactly the same.
Okay, here's the one for 99 cents. I'm going to put a link in the description of the video.
That's a different book.
What is? What, am I sharing my screen right now? Here.
The text and translation and commentary for the James is on there. But it's a different book entirely. That's the book of James.
This is the one that you want me to put a link to, right here?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And if anybody gets it and likes it, feel free to write a review on Amazon for it.
So after the video, after we're done, guys, I will put a link in the description of the video so you can link right to Amazon. Check out his book. It's only 99 cents. If you can't afford it, he'll even send you a free copy. So, yeah, thank you guys for coming. Kanani808 says, thank you for coming, James. And explaining about the translated text. Much love. Aloha. I guess she's from Hawaii. That's cool. What a beautiful place. Okay, so, yeah, anybody else have any questions or not? Because I guess there's like more people. Why is there always more people watching at the very end? I don't understand. It's like we get 10 more people come watch.
I think all I asked my Facebook profile, just look for my name, James Snapp.
What's that? You kind of broke up there, James. You kind of broke up. I didn't hear you there, buddy.
I think Oleg had a question about what is my Facebook ID. It's the same as my name right here.
James Snapp Jr. Yeah, that's how you find him on Facebook.
For Oleg, my name on Facebook, James Snapp Jr.
Yeah, James Snapp Jr. I'll even put that in the description if you want.
You can also look for the group called NT Textual Criticism.
Okay, so
in the group NT Textual Criticism that I'm the administrator at NT Textual Criticism. If you go to the group there and apply for membership, you can download the book from the files there.
Cool.
And lots of other things too.
Cool. I'll even put a link to your group in the video description there, James. NT Textual Criticism on Facebook. Cool, man. So I guess that's it. I guess we'll wrap it up then. Thank you very much for coming, James. I'm definitely going to try and set up a debate for you. Okay? I mean, definitely, you guys, everyone's going to want to see that. So I'm going to try and set that up, and I'll stay in touch with you. Okay, brother? Would you like to say a prayer before you go? You want to lead us in prayer? I did the opening one. You want to do a closing prayer, James?
Okay. Sure. Let's pray. Heavenly Father. Yeah. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time we can come together and just discuss your word. Lord, it's been described as something like an ocean where you can never go too deep. You can never be along the shore just waiting in the shallows. But Lord, we always seek your presence. We seek to be edified. We seek to be instructed and guided so that we can be able soldiers in your army, able children in your family. Through your Son, Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, brother. That was good. Okay, thank you so much for coming. You're the man, brother. I'll stay in touch with you. And you have a great night, okay, James? Thanks for giving me your time, brother. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, brother. Have a good night.
I enjoyed it.
Bye, man.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Okay, guys, that was James Snapp Jr. It's kind of sad that we had a huge argument in the channel, in the chat, because he was talking. I feel really bad, but I mean, I was listening as much as I could. He's a really knowledgeable guy. Love having him on. He's doing very, very important work. See you later, Oleg. Thanks for coming and asking all your questions, brother. Hopefully, James clarified some things for you. I wish we could listen to him more, but there was a heated debate going on in the chat. Okay, so tomorrow we have Daniel, who was in the chat, and he's going to be debating someone from Athens, Greece, on King James onlyism. So that is, I had to change the time to 10 p.m. PST. I hope that's not too late for you guys, but for this guy in Greece, I had it set up for 6 p.m., but that's 5 a.m. the next day in Greece. So that's like really early, 5 in the morning. I don't think he would want to get up at 5 a.m. just to debate. So I had to move it up to 10 p.m. our time, which is 9 a.m. in Athens, Greece. So tomorrow at 10 p.m. PST, we're going to do it. King James onlyism And then the day after that is the Preacher and Melvin round 2. Okay? Some of you guys didn't want me to have them back on my channel, but whatever. I love watching debates, and the whole friggin' chat was blowing up tonight from that, so we might as well do round 2, right? Preacher said he would stick to the format better this time. I said if he can stick to the format, I'll have round 2. So hopefully he sticks to the format for the audience's sake, actually does the cross-examination properly, and stuff like that. So that will be on the 14th on Monday. Tomorrow's a King James only debate. And yes, Savannah, I will email him. And Melvin, I'll talk to both of you guys about the time of the debate, and we'll set it all up. We're going to do it on the 14th on Monday, okay? But I will email you guys after. Thank you guys so much for watching again. You guys are awesome. I love you guys. God bless. I'm going to put links in the description to James's book and his Facebook group. And yeah, you guys have an awesome night. Bye.